The neighborhood had been designed to look calm, orderly, and effortlessly respectable. Neatly trimmed hedges lined identical pavements, driveways were kept free of oil stains, and the houses followed a strict palette of neutral tones that blended together until no single home stood out. It was the kind of place where nothing was supposed to happen, and for years that illusion had held. When the quiet homeowner moved in, no one noticed anything unusual at first. He arrived without spectacle, without renovation crews or noisy celebrations. His furniture was delivered quickly, his bins were put out on the correct days, and his lawn never grew a centimeter beyond regulation length. He nodded politely at neighbors, returned parcels left at his door, and never once complained about noise or parking. To the casual observer, he was exactly what the Homeowners Association claimed to want. The HOA, however, thrived on control rather than harmony. Its board had long since stopped functioning as a group dedicated to community well-being. Instead, it had become a small circle of residents who enjoyed authority for its own sake. Rules were enforced selectively, fines were issued inconsistently, and decisions were made behind closed doors. The board justified its actions as maintaining standards, but everyone living there understood the unspoken truth. Compliance was less important than submission. At first, the homeowner remained beneath their notice. He paid his fees on time, followed every guideline in the handbook, and kept his property immaculate. But calm people in controlling systems often become targets not because they break rules, but because they do not react. Silence can feel like resistance to those who expect obedience to come with visible fear. The first notice arrived without warning. It was slipped into his letterbox on a standard HOA letterhead, printed with formal language and vague references to violations. The alleged issue concerned exterior aesthetics, though no specific problem was identified. There were no photographs, no measurements, no citations from the rulebook, just a deadline and a warning of escalating penalties. He read the notice once, then again, carefully. He did not respond immediately. He did not storm into the HOA office or post angrily on the neighborhood forum. Instead, he continued his routine exactly as before. His garden remained compliant. His windows stayed clean. His behavior did not change. This lack of reaction unsettled the board. A second notice followed, this one more aggressive in tone. It listed multiple supposed infractions, each described in ambiguous terms. The language suggested urgency and implied consequences without clearly stating them. The board expected this to provoke anxiety, perhaps even panic. They were used to residents rushing to apologize, begging for extensions, or arguing emotionally. Once again, there was no visible response. Behind the scenes, the board interpreted silence as defiance. They convinced themselves that the homeowner was attempting to challenge their authority by ignoring them. In truth, he was doing something else entirely, something they never considered. He was reading every document carefully and quietly building a timeline. As the weeks passed, the notices became more frequent. Fines were added without explanation. Deadlines overlapped. References were made to previous warnings that did not exist. The paper trail grew messy, contradictory, and increasingly careless. The board assumed volume would compensate for accuracy. Other residents began to notice, not because the homeowner complained, but because HOA enforcement vehicles lingered near his property more often than necessary. Inspectors appeared repeatedly, sometimes photographing the same perfectly compliant features from different angles. Rumors spread in the predictable way they always did in tightly managed communities. Some assumed he must have done something wrong. Others quietly wondered why the board seemed so focused on someone who caused no trouble at all. The homeowner remained unchanged. He continued his early morning walks. He kept his blinds at the approved height. He smiled politely when spoken to and declined to engage in gossip. He never spoke publicly about the notices. That restraint, more than anything else, made the board uneasy. Then came the escalation. A formal letter arrived stating that the HOA had initiated proceedings for severe non-compliance. The language was deliberately intimidating, filled with references to legal action, property seizure, and eviction. It framed the situation as final, as though the outcome had already been decided. The board had crossed from intimidation into open threat. To them, this was the ultimate show of power. To the homeowner, it was confirmation. He did not react outwardly, but internally, something shifted. The board had now made claims that required evidence they did not possess. They had put their authority on paper in a way that could be examined, challenged, and dismantled. The threats were no longer vague. They were specific enough to be tested. Still, he waited. The board scheduled a meeting to finalize enforcement. Notices were sent out to residents, framed as routine HOA business. The agenda listed compliance enforcement as a minor item, buried beneath budget discussions and landscaping updates. The board believed this would prevent attention and ensure control of the narrative. What they did not understand was that every document they had sent, every fine they had added, and every deadline they had invented had already been catalogued. The homeowner had created a complete record, cross-referenced against the HOA own governing documents and local property law. He had done so quietly, patiently, and without the slightest hint of confrontation. To the board, he was still just the quiet homeowner. To the situation itself, however, he had become something else entirely, a problem they had created through arrogance. As the meeting date approached, tension settled over the neighborhood like a low, persistent hum. Residents sensed something was coming, though no one could quite articulate what it was. The board remained confident, convinced they were about to make an example of someone who dared not comply. The homeowner prepared in silence, knowing that the next chapter would no longer belong to the HOA. And when the meeting finally arrived, the calm surface of the community was about to fracture in ways no one expected. The days leading up to the HOA meeting unfolded with a strange, restrained energy. Nothing visibly changed, yet everything beneath the surface felt tighter, more deliberate. The board members carried themselves with a heightened sense of importance, convinced they were about to assert authority in a way that would remind the entire neighborhood who truly held power. Their confidence was rooted not in law or fairness, but in habit. For years, intimidation had worked. Residents complied because it was easier than resisting. The quiet homeowner watched this build-up without comment. He did not attend informal gatherings, did not participate in online discussions, and did not attempt to rally neighbors to his side. His approach was the opposite of what the board expected. There were no warning signs, no emotional outbursts, no defensive explanations. He continued to exist as he always had, calm, orderly, and observant. Inside his home, however, the preparation was meticulous. Every notice was laid out chronologically. Each fine was logged with dates, amounts, and stated reasons. HOA bylaws were crossed, checked line by line against the accusations made. Where rules were cited vaguely, he marked the absence. Where procedures were skipped, he highlighted the deviation. He compared timelines, discovering overlapping penalties and impossible deadlines that contradicted the association's own governing documents. What emerged was not just a defense, but a pattern. The board had not followed procedure. They had issued violations without inspection records, levied fines without hearings, and escalated enforcement without proper notice. Even more troubling, certain notices referenced amendments to bylaws that had never been voted on by residents. The paperwork revealed a quiet but persistent overreach that went far beyond one homeowner. Meanwhile, the board members reassured one another. They spoke confidently about setting precedent, about reinforcing standards, about reminding residents that the HOA existed for a reason. They framed the homeowner as uncooperative, even hostile, despite having no evidence of either. In their minds, silence had become guilt. The meeting was scheduled for early evening in the community hall, a neutral space the HOA often used to create an illusion of transparency. Chairs were arranged in neat rows. A projector displayed the agenda. On paper, it looked like any other monthly gathering. In reality, it had been carefully structured to minimize discussion. Residents began to arrive, drawn more by curiosity than concern. Word had spread that enforcement was escalating against one of their own, and though no one wanted to be openly involved, many wanted to see how it would unfold. The homeowner arrived quietly, taking a seat near the back. He carried no visible documents, no folders, nothing that suggested preparation. The board interpreted this as weakness. As the meeting progressed, routine items were rushed through, financial summaries were skimmed, maintenance updates were acknowledged without detail. When the enforcement section arrived, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The board spoke with rehearsed authority, presenting the situation as already resolved. They described repeated violations, ongoing non-compliance, and the necessity of decisive action to protect property values. They framed the homeowner as a problem that needed to be addressed, not as a person but as a precedent. What they did not anticipate was the reaction of the room. Not outrage, not support, but confusion. The descriptions did not align with what residents saw every day. The homeowner's property was among the most well-kept on the street. There had been no visible changes, no construction, no obvious breaches of HOA rules. The board's language sounded dramatic, but the evidence was conspicuously absent. Still, the board pressed on. They referenced notices, fines, and legal authority, assuming no one would challenge the specifics. This was how they had always operated, through assertion rather than proof. They expected the homeowner to finally react, to plead or protest, thereby justifying their position. Instead, he remained still. As the board prepared to conclude the matter, something unexpected happened. A few residents shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, not because the homeowner had spoken, but because the board's confidence was beginning to feel hollow. The more they spoke, the more apparent the gaps became. The homeowner waited until the final moment. When attention finally turned toward him, it was not dramatic. It was measured. He did not raise his voice. He did not display anger. He simply acknowledged that he had been listening carefully. What followed was not a defense, but a clarification. He did not dispute the HOA authority in general terms. He did not argue emotionally. He referenced their own documents, their own procedures, and their own timelines. He pointed out inconsistencies without accusation, omissions without insult. Each observation was grounded in the association's rules and local property regulations. The room grew quieter. The board members began to realize that this was not a resident reacting impulsively. This was someone who understood the structure they relied on better than they did themselves. Their confidence wavered not because he challenged them, but because he exposed the fragility of their claims simply by describing them accurately. He did not yet reveal his background. He did not need to. The clarity of his reasoning spoke for itself. By the time he finished, the enforcement narrative no longer held. The board attempted to regain control, but their responses lacked substance. They relied on authority without explanation, repeating phrases instead of addressing points. Each deflection made the imbalance more visible. Residents were no longer passive observers. They were listening. The meeting ended without resolution, something that almost never happened. The board announced a review period, framing it as procedural caution. In truth, it was retreat. They needed time not to reconsider fairness, but to understand how they had lost control so quickly. The homeowner left the meeting the same way he had entered, quietly, without spectacle. But the atmosphere had changed. The board members remained behind, tense and unsettled, aware that their usual tactics had failed. They had attempted to intimidate someone who did not intimidate easily. And as the hall emptied, it became clear that the next phase of this conflict would not be governed by threats or assumptions, but by something far more dangerous to unchecked power: scrutiny. The board had underestimated the quiet homeowner, and that mistake was about to cost them everything they thought they controlled. The days after the meeting felt different in the neighborhood, as though an invisible structure had shifted overnight. Nothing physical had changed. The houses still looked the same, the lawns were still trimmed, and the HOA notices still appeared on doors across the estate. Yet the sense of unquestioned authority that once surrounded the board had weakened. People spoke more quietly, but they also listened more closely. The HOA board, on the other hand, reacted with urgency masked as composure. Behind closed doors, emails circulated rapidly. Old files were pulled from digital archives. Past enforcement cases were reviewed with a level of concern that had never existed before. For the first time, the board was no longer confident that its records would protect it. The homeowner had demonstrated something dangerous: the ability to read between the lines and understand what rules actually meant, not just how they were enforced. The board attempted to regain momentum by doubling down. A revised notice was issued to the homeowner, reframed as a procedural update rather than an escalation. The language was softer, more cautious, filled with phrases suggesting cooperation and compliance. Gone were the aggressive threats of eviction. In their place were references to ongoing discussions and clarification of standards. It was an unspoken admission that their previous approach had failed. The homeowner received the notice and added it to his growing file. He noted the shift in tone, the absence of specific violations, and the careful avoidance of legal language. This was no longer an attempt to intimidate. It was damage control. The board was trying to appear reasonable without addressing the core issue: their lack of authority to do what they had already threatened. As the HOA hesitated, residents began to re-examine their own experiences. Small inconsistencies they had previously ignored now felt significant. Fines that had once been accepted without question were suddenly remembered with discomfort. Notices that had seemed routine now appeared suspiciously vague. The homeowner had not encouraged this reflection, but his calm resistance had given others permission to think. The board sensed this shift and responded the only way it knew how, by trying to isolate the problem. They framed the situation internally as a misunderstanding with one difficult resident, insisting that broader concerns were irrelevant. They reassured themselves that if they could resolve this case quietly, everything would return to normal. What they failed to realize was that the homeowner was no longer focused solely on defending himself. He had begun examining the HOA itself. The governing documents revealed more than procedural errors. They showed amendments that had been applied inconsistently, votes that had been recorded without quorum, and enforcement powers that had gradually expanded without proper approval. What initially appeared to be incompetence now looked increasingly like a pattern of deliberate overreach. The homeowner compared these findings with public records. Land registry documents contradicted several HOA claims regarding boundary enforcement. Local council guidelines limited the association's authority in ways the board routinely ignored. Most critically, eviction powers referenced in their threats did not exist at all under applicable property law. The threat that had started everything was not just exaggerated, it was impossible. Meanwhile, the board scheduled another meeting, this time closed to general residents. The stated purpose was administrative review. In reality, it was an attempt to reassert control and decide how to handle someone who clearly understood the system better than they did. They debated whether to consult external legal advice, but hesitation prevailed. Seeking counsel risked exposing past actions they preferred remain unquestioned. Instead, they chose confidence over caution. A formal letter was drafted, asserting compliance authority once again, though more carefully worded. It invited the homeowner to resolve matters amicably while subtly reaffirming the board's position. The letter assumed that enough pressure, applied slowly, would still succeed. The homeowner read it with interest rather than concern. He now had confirmation that the board was acting without guidance. They were improvising, reacting rather than planning. This was not the behavior of an organization confident in its legal footing. It was the behavior of one hoping no one would force it to justify itself. At this point, he made a decision. Up until now, he had allowed the board to reveal its weaknesses on its own. He had spoken only enough to halt immediate harm and expose procedural flaws. But the situation had grown beyond personal inconvenience. The board's actions affected the entire community, and their misuse of authority was no longer hypothetical. The next HOA meeting was announced, again framed as routine. The agenda included enforcement policy updates and governance review. To the board, it was a chance to regain narrative control. To the homeowner, it was an opportunity to bring clarity where ambiguity had been weaponized. Residents sensed the importance of the meeting even before it happened. Attendance was noticeably higher. People arrived earlier, sat closer, and paid more attention. The board members noticed this and mistook it for support. The homeowner arrived as he always did, without fanfare. This time, however, he carried a slim folder. It was understated, unmarked, and deliberately unthreatening. He took his seat and waited. As the meeting began, the board spoke at length about transparency, cooperation, and the importance of community standards. Their words sounded polished, almost rehearsed. But beneath the surface there was tension. They avoided specifics, spoke in generalities, and carefully sidestepped references to past enforcement actions. When the time came for questions, the homeowner stood. There was no dramatic pause, no raised voice, no visible emotion. He did not accuse or attack. He did not demand apologies. Instead, he began outlining facts, dates, documents, clauses, and legal definitions. He explained methodically how the HOA authority was structured and where it ended. He clarified the difference between guidelines and enforceable rules. He described the legal impossibility of eviction under the association's current framework. Then, without emphasis, he explained his background. He was a property barrister. The room changed instantly. It was not shock that followed, but recognition. The board members understood immediately what this meant. This was not someone learning the law as he went. This was someone trained to interpret it, challenge it, and apply it precisely. Their earlier confidence evaporated, replaced by something far more dangerous to unchecked authority than anger credibility. He continued, not as a threat, but as an explanation. He outlined the potential consequences of continued overreach, not in dramatic terms, but as a matter of professional obligation. He described what scrutiny would look like if brought to external authorities. He did not say what he would do. He simply explained what could happen. The board had no response. The meeting ended in silence heavier than any confrontation. Residents left with a new understanding of the power dynamics that had governed their community for years. The board remained seated, aware that their position was no longer secure. The homeowner left quietly once again, but this time the story was no longer about him alone. It was about what happens when authority is finally forced to answer to the rules it claims to enforce. And in the chapters ahead, that reckoning was only just beginning. The aftermath of the meeting unfolded slowly, but with undeniable force. The revelation of the homeowner's background did not spark chaos or open confrontation. Instead, it introduced something far more destabilizing to the HOA board: hesitation. For the first time in years, every decision felt heavy, every notice risky, every assumption questionable. Authority that had once flowed effortlessly now stalled under the weight of potential consequences. The board did not issue new violations the following week. Inspectors stopped lingering on pavements with clipboards. The familiar pattern of enforcement letters quietly paused, as though the system itself had lost confidence in its own momentum. To outside observers, it appeared as though nothing was happening. To those paying attention, it was obvious that everything had changed. Inside the board's private communications, panic took a more controlled shape. Emails became longer, more formal, and far more cautious. Phrases once used casually were now debated at length. Members questioned whether certain actions had been properly authorized, whether older records were complete, whether past decisions might invite scrutiny if revisited. No one said it openly, but everyone understood the same truth. They had operated for years without expecting anyone to truly challenge them. The homeowner did not press his advantage. He did not contact the board privately or make demands. He allowed the silence to do its work. In systems built on intimidation, quiet confidence is unsettling. The board could not predict his next move because he gave no indication that one was coming. That uncertainty was far more uncomfortable than open resistance. Residents, however, had begun to change. People who once avoided HOA meetings now attended regularly. Questions that had once gone unasked were now raised politely but persistently. Requests for clarification replaced passive acceptance. The tone of the community shifted from compliance to curiosity, and curiosity is difficult to control. The board attempted to respond by reasserting transparency. They announced an internal review of enforcement practices, framing it as proactive governance rather than reactive defense. Committees were formed, though their purpose was unclear. Documents were promised, but delivery was slow. Each attempt to regain trust felt performative rather than sincere. Behind the scenes, one issue loomed larger than the rest: the eviction threat. The board knew it had overstepped, but acknowledging that publicly would undermine years of unchecked authority, they debated whether to quietly withdraw the claim or reframe it as a misunderstanding. Neither option satisfied everyone. Admitting error risked exposure, denial risked escalation. The homeowner watched this carefully. He understood institutional behavior well enough to recognize when systems begin to fracture. The board was no longer united. Some members wanted to de-escalate and protect themselves individually. Others believed doubling down would preserve control. This internal conflict was not visible to residents, but it shaped every delayed decision and every awkward pause during meetings. At the same time, external pressure began to mount. A resident requested access to HOA records under applicable disclosure rules. Another questioned the legitimacy of past fines during a meeting. A third quietly contacted the local council for clarification on HOA authority. None of these actions were coordinated, yet all were influenced by the same realization: the board was not infallible. The homeowner did not lead this shift, but he had made it possible. As weeks passed, the board issued a formal notice withdrawing the eviction language from its correspondence. It was subtle, almost apologetic in tone, and carefully avoided admitting fault. The letter framed the change as a clarification rather than a correction. To the board, it was a strategic retreat. To residents, it was confirmation that pressure worked. The homeowner acknowledged the notice without comment. He did not celebrate or publicize it. He simply added it to his file. What mattered was not the withdrawal itself, but what it revealed. The board had been willing to threaten eviction without authority. That fact alone undermined every enforcement action they had taken in the past. If they could fabricate power once, they could have done so many times before. The community was beginning to understand that. In response, the board sought external legal advice. This decision came late and reluctantly. When council reviewed the HOA actions, the findings were predictable but devastating. Procedures had been bypassed. Powers had been overstated. Records were incomplete. While not every action was unlawful, the cumulative risk was significant. Continued enforcement without reform could expose the board to legal challenge. The board now faced a choice it had long avoided: reform or resistance. Some members resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. Others attempted to distance themselves from past decisions. New faces appeared at meetings, uncertain and cautious. The once confident leadership structure began to unravel. Throughout all of this, the homeowner remained a constant presence, calm, observant, unchanged. He did not demand resignations or threaten lawsuits. He understood that accountability achieved through process lasts longer than victory achieved through confrontation. The system was correcting itself because it had been forced to confront its own limits. By the end of the 4th month, the HOA announced a comprehensive governance review. Enforcement was suspended pending revision. Residents were invited to participate in updating bylaws. For the first time, the association spoke openly about aligning its practices with actual law. The neighborhood felt lighter, not because conflict had ended, but because fear had. The homeowner's situation was effectively resolved. The notices stopped. The fines were quietly removed from his account. No apology was offered, but none was needed. The outcome spoke for itself. What remained was the broader reckoning. The HOA had not simply targeted the wrong person. It had exposed its own fragility by doing so. Authority that relies on ignorance cannot survive scrutiny, and once scrutiny begins, it rarely confines itself to one case. As the board struggled to rebuild legitimacy, residents watched closely, aware that the balance of power had shifted permanently. The rules had not disappeared, but they were no longer unquestionable. And as the next chapter approached, one thing became clear to everyone involved. This story was no longer about an HOA and a homeowner. It was about what happens when quiet knowledge meets unchecked control and refuses to look away. The governance review marked a turning point, but not an ending. For the HOA, it was the beginning of a long and uncomfortable process of exposure. For the residents, it was the first time they had been invited to look behind the curtain of authority and see how decisions had actually been made. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted from passive observation to cautious engagement, and that shift changed everything. The review process began with document requests. Financial records, enforcement logs, meeting minutes, and correspondence were gathered and circulated. What had once existed only in fragmented files and private inboxes was now being assembled into a coherent picture. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain residents had been fined repeatedly for minor issues, while others had never received a single notice despite clear violations. Enforcement had never been consistent. It had been personal. As residents compared experiences, a shared understanding formed. The HOA had not been a neutral body enforcing rules evenly. It had been shaped by individual preferences, grudges, and unchecked discretion. The Quiet Homeowner's case had simply been the most visible example of a system that had operated without accountability for years. The board attempted to frame these discoveries as growing pains rather than misconduct. They emphasized volunteer fatigue, administrative oversight, and the challenges of managing a diverse community. While some residents were sympathetic, many were not. Good intentions could not explain fabricated powers or invented procedures. The difference between mistake and misuse was becoming increasingly clear. Throughout the review, the homeowner remained deliberately understated. He participated when asked, clarified legal points when necessary, and declined to dominate discussions. His credibility did not come from volume or insistence, but from consistency. When he spoke, people listened, not because he demanded attention, but because his words were grounded in fact. The board's legal advisors recommended sweeping reforms. Enforcement powers needed to be rewritten. Due process had to be formalized. Appeals procedures required independence. Most importantly, the HOA needed to clearly define what it could not do, not just what it claimed to control. This was a concept the previous board had never considered. As reforms were proposed, resistance surfaced. A small group of long-serving members argued that loosening control would invite chaos. They warned of falling property values, unruly behavior, and the erosion of community standards. Their arguments echoed familiar fears, but they lacked evidence. The community had not descended into disorder during the enforcement pause. If anything, cooperation had improved. The homeowner observed these debates with professional detachment. He recognized the pattern well. When authority is challenged, those who benefited most from it often frame reform as risk. But fear, once exposed, loses much of its power. Eventually, a vote was scheduled to approve the new governance framework. It was the most heavily attended meeting in the HOA history. Residents who had never spoken publicly before stood and participated. The process was slow, sometimes uncomfortable, but undeniably democratic. Decisions were debated rather than assumed. The reforms passed, with them came tangible change. Fines issued without hearings were voided. Enforcement required documentation and independent review. Eviction language was permanently removed from HOA communications. Transparency requirements were strengthened, giving residents ongoing access to records that had once been tightly controlled. The board itself changed as well. Several members stepped down following the vote. New elections were held, bringing in individuals more focused on stewardship than authority. The tone of meetings softened. The emphasis shifted from punishment to problem solving. For the homeowner, the personal impact was subtle but meaningful. His account was cleared completely. Past fines were refunded without explanation. The property that had once been treated as a liability was now simply another home in the neighborhood. The threat that had hung over him for months dissolved quietly, without ceremony. He did not celebrate publicly. He did not recount his role or claim victory. He continued to live as he always had, maintaining his home, greeting neighbors politely, and avoiding unnecessary attention. But his presence now carried a different weight. He was no longer invisible. Other residents began to approach him quietly, not for legal advice, but for reassurance. His case had shown them that resistance did not have to be loud to be effective. Knowledge applied calmly could reshape power structures that seemed immovable. The HOA, now operating under new rules, moved forward cautiously. Mistakes were corrected openly. Decisions were documented thoroughly. The fear of scrutiny had become a form of discipline, ensuring that authority remained grounded in reality rather than assumption. As the months passed, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. It was shared in fragments: an HOA that tried to evict the wrong homeowner, a board that overreached, a quiet resident who understood the law. The details varied, but the lesson remained the same. Control without accountability is fragile. The homeowner never corrected the narrative. He understood that myths often carry truth more effectively than facts. What mattered was not how the story was told, but what it changed. And as the community settled into its new balance, one final chapter remained, not of confrontation, but of consequence. Because systems that are forced to reform leave behind something lasting. They leave behind awareness. And awareness, once established, does not easily fade. Chapter 6. The long-term effects of the upheaval were not immediate, but they were unmistakable. The neighborhood did not transform overnight into a model of perfection, nor did every lingering tension disappear. What changed was something far more subtle and far more powerful: expectations. Residents no longer assumed authority was absolute. They no longer treated HOA decisions as final simply because they were issued on official letterhead. The culture had shifted from obedience to understanding. The reformed HOA operated carefully, almost cautiously, as if aware that every action would now be examined rather than absorbed. Notices were detailed. Timelines were reasonable. Enforcement, when it occurred, followed procedures that were visible and consistent. The board spoke less about power and more about responsibility. This was not because they had suddenly become idealistic, but because they understood the cost of overreach. The quiet homeowner continued to live without incident. His days returned to predictable rhythms, free from the background tension that had once hovered over his property. The ordeal had not hardened him or made him suspicious. If anything, it reaffirmed something he had always known. Systems are only as strong as the scrutiny they are prepared to withstand. He never sought recognition for what had happened. When neighbors referenced the events in passing, he listened without correction. When people speculated about motives or strategies, he offered no commentary. He understood that the outcome spoke more clearly than any explanation he could give. Over time, the story became part of the neighborhood's informal history. New residents heard about it second-hand, often simplified into a cautionary tale about an HOA that went too far. The specifics faded, but the principle remained intact. People learned that compliance was not the same as surrender, and that rules were meant to be understood, not feared. The former board members who had resigned disappeared quietly from community life. Some sold their homes, others stayed but remained distant, their influence permanently diminished. The authority they once wielded had not been transferred, it had been redistributed. Power now rested less with individuals and more with process. The local council, alerted indirectly by resident inquiries, conducted a routine review of HOA practices in the area. While no formal sanctions were imposed, guidance was issued reinforcing legal boundaries. Other associations took notice. The ripple effect extended beyond one street, subtly recalibrating how similar organizations approached enforcement. The homeowner watched these developments from a distance. He did not intervene or advise. He understood that lasting change cannot be micromanaged. It must be allowed to take root naturally, shaped by shared experience rather than imposed direction. What lingered most strongly was not resentment, but clarity. Residents now understood that calm resistance could be more effective than confrontation, that documentation mattered, that silence, when paired with preparation, could destabilize even the most confident misuse of authority. These lessons did not inspire rebellion, they inspired discernment. The HOA meetings grew quieter over time, not because interest faded, but because urgency diminished. When systems function fairly, drama loses its fuel. The association still existed, still governed common spaces and standards, but it no longer dominated lives through fear. It had been returned to its intended scale. The homeowner's role in all of this was never officially acknowledged. There was no statement, no formal recognition, no apology issued in writing, yet his impact was undeniable. By simply insisting that rules be followed as written, he had forced an institution to confront its own limits. In the end, the attempted eviction became irrelevant. It had never been about removing one person from a property. It had been about testing how far authority could stretch before someone noticed. That test failed. What replaced it was something far less dramatic, but far more durable: accountability. The neighborhood moved forward, shaped quietly by the knowledge that systems are not self-justifying. They require understanding, participation, and sometimes challenge. Not loud challenge, not aggressive challenge, just informed, unwavering attention. The homeowner remained what he had always been to the casual observer: quiet, respectful, and unremarkable. But to those who understood what had occurred, he represented something else entirely. He was proof that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits patiently, reads carefully, and waits for the moment when truth becomes unavoidable. And when that moment comes, it does not raise its voice. It simply stands.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.